We're going to get into the really good stuff. And because there are no children here, we can blame them for everything, and we'll all be happy with that. So we're going to talk about communication in parenting during this class. And once again, I think if we could do this correctly, if we could communicate effectively with our kids, there'd be so fewer problems in parenting. But once again, Mary and I would be out of a job. So feel free to mistreat and miscommunicate with your kids, because then we'll have business for lots of years to come. So, effective communication, you got to figure out first, what do I mean by effective communication? Think about ineffective communication first. In a typical household, excuse me, especially with young kids, the majority of interactions between parent and child are either an interrogation or an order. Wouldn't you agree with that? It's either an interrogation, where were you, what'd you just do, how did that get there, why didn't you pick that up, or it's an order. Pick that up, get in here, go brush your teeth, do your homework. That's the vast majority of communication, typically between parents and kids. Of course, there's also the world's most useless question. Sometimes there's a question, an interrogation, but among the world of useless questions to ask a child is, why did you do that? That is the world, it's been statistically proven to be the most useless question on the face of this earth. You might as well never ask that again. Why did you do that? What a waste of time. So, what it is this. Mostly when a parent communicates with a child, it's to do what? It's to make the parent's life more convenient, to quiet things down, to get something picked up, to get the child to do something. So the purpose of communication, it seems, is to make the parent's life more convenient. Instead, this should be the goal of communication: to teach, to train, and to build a relationship. If we would limit our statements to our kids to do one of these three things, we'd probably never talk to them again, unless we do it with intentionality, that the things we say, the keys to communication of kids: teaching, training, building a relationship. That's what makes communication effective between a parent and a child. Ineffective communication, the way I was just talking about it, that's so easy for us. Why? Because who did we learn to communicate from? Our parents, right? So yes, our parents, I gotta figure, our parents, they taught us how to parent one of two ways. Either you heard them say things or you saw them do things and you said, I am never going to do that when I'm a parent. Or they actually did some things right, and you said, you know, I don't like the way he did this or that, but that he did correctly, and I'm going to imitate that as a parent. So we learn ineffective communication from the mistakes that our parents made, one way or another. So how do we fix that? First, we have to understand something about child neurological development. So this, once again, I'm a neuropsychologist. This is my favorite part. Forgive me if I digress, but I want to talk a little bit about the developing brain. Now, you can't, I've said this many times over the years, you can't know anything about the brain and be an atheist, because it is such a miracle. It's such a miracle. And I've been studying it for 33 years, and I'm still astounded that you can have 100 billion, most people, it's between 10 and 100 billion. Some are considerably less, I think. Some are considerably more. But you have around 100 billion neurons or brain cells in your brain, each forming circuitry, you know, and any one brain cell connects to several others through dendritic branching, we call it. So you have these multitude, unimaginable number of circuits that form in your brain, each one doing a different thing. So computers can do things quickly because they do one thing at a time, one piece of information at a time. Or I guess if you're a computer scientist, 16 or 32 pieces of information at a time. The human brain, it's millions. That's why you can do so many complex things without even thinking about it. You know, driving a car, if you don't mind me digressing, when you drive a car, there's millions of calculations going on all the time. Your foot senses the pressure of the pedal against your skin, you're monitoring speed, distance, you're monitoring your sense of your proprioceptive senses, balance, and all that stuff's going on. And what are you thinking about? Well, how do I get my dry cleaning picked up? You know, what I have to do tomorrow. Now, Mary will allege that I don't even give the driving that much thought, but that's a different subject. So the brain is, I always think of Isaiah 55:9. Isaiah 55:9 is when it's, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts. When you study the brain, that's the scripture that you'll it's just a miracle. But it doesn't always start out that way. So the first slide I want to show you, that little cue ball, yeah, I do have them in the right order. That little cue ball is the brain of a 12-week-old fetus. Now, what I want you to look at, and I know this laser won't come through in the transmission, but this white matter, that's the cerebral cortex. All your thinking, everything that makes us human, our thoughts, our abstract reasoning, music, literature, everything that we do that makes us human has to do with this white thing, this white part on the outer covering of our brain. Now, at 12 weeks, we've got some landmarks that are constant from one brain to another. This is the longitudinal fissure. We all have one of those. This is the Sylvian and Rolandic fissures. So when we're starting out, our brains kind of look the same, like that. Now, watch this. That's 12-week-old fetus. This is a 25-week-old fetus. So let's see, 12, what's the difference between 12 and 25? Carry the 8, multiply by, so roughly 13 weeks, something like that. Yeah, you go from that, and that's all white matter, to gray matter, which is when neurons branch out and they form circuits, the dendrites connect and form this gray matter on the outside. So in that short amount of time, and this baby hasn't even been born yet. Now, I'm presuming it's not the same baby in both pictures, okay? You got that. So, so much development has happened in just those few amount of weeks, right? And the baby hasn't even been born yet. Now, here's a graphic representation of the same thing. On the y-axis is percentage of eventual adult brain weight, and on the x-axis is age in years. What I want you to see is how much development happens between age 0, you're born with about 20% of your eventual adult brain weight, until about age 5, you achieve about 95% of your ultimate adult brain weight. In other words, about 95% of your brain development happens in this critical 0 to 5 year period. As an aside, this is why Mary and I are huge proponents of early intervention. Because as that brain is growing and circuiting, creating circuits, if there's a deficit, if there's a problem or a weakness in one area of the cerebral cortex, you remediate it, you stimulate it, and the brain, through something called plasticity, will circuit itself around the problem. But there's this critical 5-year period where you have to do that. So we're big on early intervention. If you have a child with a speech problem or a motor problem or a learning problem, don't delay. Have an evaluation, get the appropriate physical, speech, occupational therapy, whatever it is. The rest of your life, from age 5 on, you've got the hardware in place. You've got 95% of the hardware in place. The rest is software. All you're doing is learning, is putting software into the hardware, from what I understand about computers. So this unbelievable amount of growth and development happens in a very short amount of time. That's my point. Now, this is not so with the adult brain. That's a healthy adult, well, I mean, it's not healthy because it's not actually like in the guy, so it's no longer a healthy brain, but that's basically what a healthy adult brain looks like. And you see how much more complicated it is, all the vasculature, all the sulci, which are the wrinkles in the brain, how much more developed it is. But most of that development occurred early on. Now, with an adult brain, if something happens, this is why the effects of things like a stroke are more or less permanent after a while, because there's no more growing left to be done. You have a whole brain, and if it gets injured, it's injured. Anyway, once that hardware is in place, the rest, what we call learning, is adding software. What's happening to the thought, before we can understand how to communicate with kids, we have to understand what's happening to them cognitively during this time of development. So, I'm inviting the opinion of a Swiss psychologist, Jean Piaget, who you may have studied in Psych 101 if you ever took a basic psych class. In the 1930s, he had this theory that children's cognitive development happens in stages. Now, how did he figure that out? He used his own son as a guinea pig, his son, whose name was Laurent, if you want a piece of trivia. So he studied his own poor son. You know, our kids were raised by two psychologists. It's a miracle that they're sane. So I don't know how this kid got through it, but he came up, watching his own son and then doing some research, he came up with these stages of development. The first thing he figured out is that kids, as they develop, they move from egocentrism, where they are the center of the universe. Do you know any kids who consider themselves the center of the universe? Yes, every kid on the planet considers themselves the center of the universe, for a long time, in fact. So the first thing he theorized is that at some point they go from egocentrism to sociocentrism, which is there are other people. What an amazing revelation that must be. There are other people in the universe. Now, it may be argued that some adult males have not yet attained this second stage. Some of the men you know, that might be true. But this is the goal, for kids cognitively to go from egocentrism to sociocentrism. Now, I'm going to explain why that's relevant from a spiritual standpoint in a minute. But look at the stages you go through to get there. In Piaget's first stage, the sensory motor stage, which is from about birth to age 2, kids are what we call tabula rasa. They are blank slates. All they are a brain and a nervous system. How are they learning things? Through sensory input, hearing, sight, smell, touch. And how are they learning? All they have is a brain and some reflexes. So, if you're an infant and you touch something hot, your reflexes tell you to move your finger away. Then you start developing this idea of heat and danger and bad feelings. And you see what I'm saying? So the way the little infant brain learns is by reflexes and by incoming sensory, So they learn, their reflexes tell them when they're hungry to cry. Eventually, they notice, I can't help but notice, but every time I cry, someone sticks something in my mouth. So maybe there's a connection here. This is awesome. Let me test this out. So that's how babies learn from 0 to 2, by pairing their reflexes with the sensory input. The next stage, from age 2 to 7, is the preoperational stage. The main thing that happens during that time is kids develop the capacity for symbolic play. This is when you see a kid using a shoebox as a truck, So they can obviously make some kind of abstract connection there. But they still, at this stage, they don't understand logic. They can't draw logical consequences because they just are now learning language, so that's a problem. And they can't see things from the point of view of others. They're still in this egocentric stage. So, this is why it surprises me when parents trying to raise their kids as Christians are disappointed when their little 7-year-old doesn't seem to get these huge philosophical abstract concepts, such as sacrificial behavior, empathy, the whole concept of God. And these parents are disappointed, and they ask me about it. I'm like, dude, it's just a little kid. He does not yet have the cognitive capacity to handle the whole thing of empathy for others, being sacrificial, all we're trying to do with kids during this stage is to get them to obey and to be relatively decent citizens, So what I'm saying is, when we're trying to communicate, we're still, if you're in this stage, you're still pretty far from, we want you to obey because your life will be better. You'll treat people they don't know nothing of that. All they know is, if you don't do what I tell you to, you're going to get this. And if you do what I tell you to, you're going to get that. And that's the way it should be. That's all they understand at the moment. Now, the next stage that comes along, so in other words, stop trying to lecture them with issues of humanity, the great philosophical, okay? They're only 2 to 7. In the concrete operational stage, which goes from 7 to 11, now kids are beginning to think logically. Things make sense to them, hence the term concrete. They're thinking concretely. But they still, and they're becoming a little less egocentric, but they still can't think abstractly. Therefore, because they can't, abstract reasoning means manipulating things in your mind that are not there right in front of you. It takes extrapolation. It takes, they still can't do that. Therefore, they can't figure out what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, all right? So here we are trying to urge them to be evangelistic and that there are poor people in the world and they're not seeming to get it. They still can't get it yet. They're cognitively not yet, in most kids, capable of doing that. So don't get all bent out of shape when they don't grasp these big philosophical issues. The last part, the formal operational stage, goes from 11 until who knows. Now, finally, kids are able to think abstractly. They can extrapolate from their experiences and think, put themselves in someone else's position. They can think about things that haven't happened yet. They can think about things that aren't sitting right there in front of them. For example, the concept of God. So what I'm saying is I think when we try to communicate, we're doing good jobs trying to be Christian parents, but we're trying to make things happen too quickly sometimes. And like I said, some people never achieve the formal operational stage where they develop empathy and a big worldview and a big picture of the good of others over good of self. You with me so far? So just when you get there, at this last stage, can you contemplate things like that? But it takes a long time is what I'm saying. Even as teens, kids are still on that cusp between egocentrism and sociocentrism. You see it in the way they act, They start to feel guilty about doing things that are selfish. But yet at the same time, they think they're knowledgeable enough that they can make their own decisions. So it's a process is what I'm saying. And I think we think kids are going to reason in a more mature, abstract level than they're capable of, and they're not prepared for it. So it's okay. So if you have a preteen or a teenager studying the Bible, what I'm saying is if they can't understand the significance and the magnitude of their sin, how it affects others and how it affects God, you're not a failure as a parent, okay? They're just cognitively not ready for it. They may not be ready to handle it just yet. That doesn't mean you give up. That means you read more of the Bible and you show them by example, right? Now, one more thing you have to know about brain development, especially teen brain development, is this. See that blue thing? It's not blue in real life. This is a graphic thing. That part of the brain is called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is what differentiates us from lower forms of life. It's the seat of everything that makes us human. The frontal lobe is your seat of judgment. Your seat of it's your ability to control your own impulses, instead of caving into your own nature. The frontal lobe happens to be the last part of the brain to develop. So most of it happens 95% up till age 5. The rest of it is this frontal lobe developing. So what I'm saying is, and the frontal lobe doesn't develop completely until early 20s, early adulthood. So in other words, we expect our kids, our teens, to be self-controlled, not impulsive, giving, outgoing, thinking of others above themselves. What I'm telling you is they don't have the gears in place yet, okay? The gears of impulse control, this last gear doesn't even form completely until the young 20s. So, again, I'm saying we get disappointed because things aren't happening fast enough, but you have to understand these stages of development. Now, what does that mean in a practical sense? Think about your role as a parent. What does this mean? This means that when kids are young, you're Moses. You are a lawgiver. You're not an explainer. You're not a theology professor. You're a lawgiver. This is what we need you to do. This is what you're going to get if you do it. This is what's going to happen if you don't do it. We're going to talk about that more in the next class. Because of their stage of development, they don't need a reason for every rule. In fact, they can't understand a reason for every rule. So at this stage, when you're a lawgiver, a Moses, and they're at this concrete, very, egocentric part of their development, they just need to obey. We need to teach them to obey, and we do that by manipulating the environment, rewards and consequences. That's our mission when we're a Moses. Because if you think about it, that's what Moses and God did. We'll read about that in the next class, where God said, Moses is my lawgiver, and God said to the Israelites, you do this, this is what's going to happen. You don't do that, that's going to happen. Now it's up to you. That's basically what we're teaching our kids. So when they're little, you're Moses, you're a lawgiver. Now, if you do that part right, hopefully, prayerfully, when they become teens, now you can be a Jethro. Remember, Jethro became Moses' mentor, Why are you wearing yourself out, Moses, trying to deal with every problem in the Israelite community? Why don't you delegate a little bit? And Moses went, oh, thanks, Jethro, my father-in-law. So as kids get older and they develop more abstract reasoning ability and become less egocentric, then you can be more of a Jethro. But, as we'll talk about later, you're still not relinquishing your authority. We're just talking about the way you communicate changes. Now, that having been said, let me pick on the dads again a little bit. Let's talk about how dads miscommunicate, and then Mary's going to talk about moms. A lot of dads, when I asked what word characterized your family growing up, you said yelling or screaming. That's a big thing for a lot of dads. Dads who yell seem to think that volume equates with obedience. The louder you are in decibels, the more likely you are percentage-wise to obey. But like I said, that there can only be 3 reactions to yelling: shutting down, reluctant obedience, or matching violence with violence. So think about if you were raised by a yeller. How did that make you feel? Insecure, angry, intimidated. And that spills over to later. If you were raised by a dad like that, to this day, you may be sensitive to when other people are yelling and not meaning to yell. You may be oversensitive to the way your boss communicates with you or your husband or wife communicates with you because you're so used to hearing that yelling. Does that make sense? So yelling, it's pretty self-evident that that's not a good way, especially for dads to communicate, but it seems to be a default mode for men because men convert, they have a tendency to convert every feeling into anger, It's like some men, they only have they're one-trick ponies. Every emotion gets turned into anger. Joy, rage, sadness, doesn't matter, grief, it all comes out as anger. Some men are like that. But there are other ways to miscommunicate. Guilty as charged on this one. In fact, you may say, why is he putting that up there? This is a personal confession. The way my sense of humor is, I'm sarcastic. Now, I know you're out there saying, no, you sarcastic? But I tend to be, the way I'm wired, I tend to be very sarcastic. And I'll make a funny comment. But what it took me a while to realize is sarcasm sometimes it's a velvet brick. It's an insult disguised as humor. And it took me a while to figure that out. Once I did, I started everyone's laughing. I say a sarcastic comment, and everyone's laughing, but I would see it in my eyes, in the eyes of a child, one of my kids, that I had hurt him or her. So I had to learn how to control this. Now, what fruits have I reaped from this? My 3 kids, God bless them, and they're all disciples, are some of the most sarcastic human beings I've ever met. And we now exchange sarcasm like a form of currency. I say the Shapiros are very sarcastic people. And most of the time it's funny. We just have to be careful now not to hurt any feelings with sarcasm. So, once again, that may just be me, my confession. But another thing dads do a lot is they tend to communicate while they're distracted. which is not communicating at all, right? Because, now I don't mean distracted, meaning they're communicating while they're watching the ball game on TV, or they're communicating when they're, watching TV, something like that. It's when your mind isn't present. It's when you're distracted in your mind. So a kid may have you one-to-one eye lock, but what are you still thinking about sometimes as a man? What's going on at the office? What do I have to do tomorrow? That's what I mean by communicating while distracted, which is not communicating at all. Now, Ephesians 6:4 says, I'm sorry, I have an extra number in there. That's for free. I won't charge you for that. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Each of these things we have to realize, sarcasm, yelling, communicating while we're distracted, is exasperating to a child because that child feels like he or she is not getting through. So if you want to obey this scripture, you have to be careful about the way you communicate. Because exasperation in a child results in insecurity, and we don't want to raise insecure kids. Once again, going back to the fragile nature of the human ego, we may do something like this, yelling, sarcasm, communicating while distracted. We don't even think twice about it, but we say something that could have an effect for years to come, so we have to be careful. Now we'll let Mary pick on the moms.
You know, I think as moms, we can be guilty of all those things he just talked about, but I think there's some other things that we struggle with as moms when we're communicating with our kids. One is just being too busy. You know, a lot of our days as moms, especially if you have more than one child, is just dealing with the logistics of life, right? Just, she was talking about, you know, having 3 kids in middle school and then 2 younger kids, and how many teacher's notes she's getting, you know, with 5 kids. I mean, just busy. You're just busy. And a lot of our communication to our kids can be just logistical things. You know, get your shoes, get in the car, make sure you got your backpack, I'll pick you up at 3. And we never go beyond that. We never go into the communication that really gets to our kids' hearts, where we're really building relationship with them, where we're really teaching them the things that are important. And it takes time. You know, what you have to do sometimes is you have to turn off the stove, let dinner be 20 minutes late, not answer the cell phone, and sit down with your child and talk about whatever the issue is that you're dealing with right then. Talk about how their day was at school. And that's hard to do on some days. That's hard to do, but we've got to look for every opportunity to do that. I remember one time I was complaining about this. Again, this is when our kids were like middle school, high school age, and we had a big old van, and I felt like I spent my life in that van. You know, I picked them up from school, I took them to ballet practice, I took that one to taekwondo, I took that one to ball practice, then I made the circuit again, I picked the one up from ballet, and right, you know. And I was complaining to the sister about that, and she said, "You don't understand. Those are precious moments that you have those children with you. And so you need to think about what can we be talking about in the car while you're driving around town that's really important. You know, what can you be asking them about? What can you be teaching them?" And that totally changed my concept of what that time was like, you know, when I'm just doing the daily things. But again, if we're not careful, we don't take that time out to make sure that we're doing what's really essential for our kids. I think another one that we fall into, and we mentioned this a little bit this morning, but is talking to our kids in a tone of voice that we would never use with anyone else. You know, we get harsh and we get curt and we sound angry when we're talking to our kids. Again, the supermarket mom that you hear sometimes. Ways that we would never talk to a sister in church or a brother in church ever, but we talk to our kids that way. And it just becomes a habit a lot of times. You know, when our kids were little, our oldest child is very social and she's very emotional. And when she was young, when she was about 6 to 8 years old, she was very demanding. She demanded a lot of my attention. She was either happy, or sad. There was no in between, you know. And she would just wear you out in a day. She would just wear me out in a day. And one of the benefits we have in our house is when we bought our house, there was a finished basement in the bottom of the house. And so we had some single sisters. It took about a week for the single sisters to figure out we had a finished basement. And then they started calling, could I live there for 6 months? Could I live there? And we actually had a number of them that lived with us for several years. So anyway, we had this sister living in the house. And one of the smart things we did is when they came into our home, we sat down and we talked to them and we said, we know you don't have kids, you've never raised kids, but you're going to be living in our family and you're going to be seeing stuff in our family. And you know the Bible, so we would like for you to come and tell us stuff that we're doing that's not right, that you see. So anyway, we have this dear sister that's lived with us, a couple of years. And she came up one night after the kids were in bed and she said, I really would like to have a talk with you. So we sat down at the table and she said, I've listened to you talk to the 3 kids. And with the 2 youngest ones, you're really sweet and you're really kind. But with Amanda, you always sound angry when you talk with Amanda. You always sound like you're put out with her. And I'm just afraid this is going to hurt her. And we're both crying, but I knew it was correct. I mean, when she said it to me, because I felt that way when I talked to Amanda a lot of the times. And so I had to make a conscious effort at being sweet in my voice when I was talking with Amanda, even when I was frustrated with her. I would pray about it in the morning, I am so grateful to that sister for calling that to my attention. Amanda and I are best friends now. She's still a talker. She calls 4 times a day. She's married, got a baby, and she lives in another state. We still talk all the time. But I don't think we would have that relationship if somebody hadn't come to me and said, this is what it sounds like. So sometimes we've got to have other people that know our families that will come to you and say, this is what it sounds like when you talk to them, him or her. This is what it sounds like. Moms, we can also become naggers with our kids. We tell them to do something and we tell it to them 20 times in a day. We've got to, our kids, when we nag, it's like the Charlie Brown character with the teacher, right? Where all they hear is wee, 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 wee. They're not even listening to us if we're nagging them. We're going to talk in the next class about discipline. What we've got to start doing is giving consequences when our kids don't do what we ask them to do and stop the nagging, because the nagging is not beneficial. I think one of the last things for moms is, as women, we love to be in control of things, right? I mean, that's just kind of the way we're built, and especially our kids. And there's a part of that that's natural. If you have a 2-year-old in your house, it is your job to tell them what to put on, what clothes to put on, where to sit, what they're going to eat for dinner, right? That's what you do with 2-year-olds, okay? But sometime between the ages of 2 and when they go to college, we've got to stop micromanaging our kids. And it's hard when you're a mom. I've been through it. It's hard. I'll tell another story on myself. When our son was in middle school and high school, he was not a big fan of formal education. He was not our best student. And now he went to law school later and burned it up, and he's a big attorney now. But at that time, he was not a good student. And so, we would every day, what homework do you have? Did you get this turned in? Did you get your homework done? So anyway, he graduates high school, goes to college. At first, he was in town with us going to college. And he came through the house one time at about homework time. It was about 5:30 in the evening, and I'm cooking, and he's walking through the kitchen. And I say to him, now he's probably 20 at this time, I say to him, Robbie, did you get all your homework done? And luckily, he didn't react. He just looked at me and he said, Mom, how old am I? And I went, I know, but, I spent 10 years of my life saying to this boy, did you get your homework done? It's hard to give up, but we've got to let our kids make decisions, age-appropriate and maturity-appropriate decisions on their own, and stop over-controlling them, because if we do, it breaks down the relationship with them.
Okay, so now we've told you all what not to do, as if you needed lessons in that. Now let's talk about what we should do, ways to facilitate communication. You know, kids are not like miniature adults, you know? We have to communicate with our kids differently. They don't know how to identify their feelings. They don't know how to express their feelings appropriately. You can't sit them down, you know. In my office, we're child psychologists. In my office, I don't sit a 7-year-old on the couch with my clipboard and I ask them to be introspective and reflect upon the things we've discussed. No, that's not how it works. You have to communicate with kids differently. You have to be creative. Beginning with, this seems like a no-brainer and self-evident, but it is so frequently missed, this concept of one-to-one time, which is extremely important, especially if you have more than one child. Distributing some of your individual attention to each single kid, doing something that you enjoy so you have time to talk. Now, here's the thing. Kids may not be comfortable, because they're kids, sitting across the table from you having a discussion. That's because they're kids. So you have to find things to do, an activity in which you can engage that they enjoy to facilitate communication. Our office is completely set up to do that. If you come into our office, into our kid therapy room, it looks like a toy store. There's bright colors on the wall and, you know, sea life pictures, and there's a big Popeye on one wall, and there's games and puzzles and all kind of stuff. Kids love coming in there. And they love the fact that they have 1 hour with an adult who cares what they're saying. This is a revelation to many of them, that they have the undivided attention for 1 hour of an adult who gives a darn about what they're saying. That's how we get so much done. It's not because we're such great child psychologists. It's because we set up the environment to be conducive to communication. Now, it takes its toll on us. I'm going to tell this story. So we have these games that we play while we're talking to kids. Now, the ideal therapeutic game is one that's so mindless that you can continue to have a conversation while they're playing and having fun. Among such mindless games is Candyland. You've heard of Candyland? So many of you remember that from growing up. It's the first board game kids learn. And it's designed around this concept of a candy kingdom, you know, and you try to get to the king candy. It's a really easy, mindless game to play. For some reason, all kids love it, and even teenagers love it. I can't figure it out, what they love so much about Candyland. So there are days in the last 30 years of our practice where we've spent a considerable part of the day playing Candyland, up to 6 to 8 hours of a day playing Candyland. And it got so bad once that I was on my 8th game of Candyland of the day. And you know the characters in Candyland? There's one dude called Mr. Mint, and he's made out of peppermint candy canes, and he's in a candy cane forest, and he's some kind of agriculturist because he's got an axe chopping down these candy cane trees. One day I notice that the head of his axe is made out of the same candy. And I'm thinking to myself, how could he possibly cut down the tree when the axe head is of the same density of the material made of the tree? And then I went, whoa, oh, okay, I'm playing too much Candyland. Yes. Another time with Candyland, they come out with new editions periodically, and we bought one of the new editions. I happen to notice that there's no more Queen Frostine. She's now Princess Frostine. And Princess Lolly is now just called Lolly. And I started to get concerned. I was like, did they overthrow King Candy's government? Was there a coup? Is it becoming a more socialist regime in the, you know? And it bothered me so much that I called the Milton Bradley Company. I emailed them. They explained, I said, I'm very concerned about this. And they explained that they thought that little girls could no longer relate to queens anymore. It had to be a princess. So at the same time, I was simultaneously relieved and then amazed at myself that I even cared. And I thought, I'm now on the brink of insanity, and I need to take Risperdal to settlement. So the point is this. You do what you have to do to put a kid in an environment where it's something he or she enjoys that you can relate to that child, which might be miserable for you, but if you want to facilitate communication, that's what you're going to do. Because all kids will open up at least a little under those circumstances. And those times have to be planned, and it takes intentionality. So at this point, so I can recover from my Candyland trauma, we're going to take another break for 5 minutes. Candyland.